So welcome back everybody for our last session of Bitesize, and huge welcome to Emma, who's come back after 10 weeks to take this final class on the right to be respected as a social being.
Lovely to see you and everyone again. I'm just wondering if you can hear me all right, or do I need to adjust anything? So today I want to talk about something that I've been working on. I'm currently working in Amsterdam on a particular project, and this is one idea or one work in progress that I've been working on as part of that. So I want to talk about the idea of having a right to be respected as a social being. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that and some of the reasons that I think we might have for thinking that we have this right. Then at the end, I'm going to just gesture towards some of the implications that such a right, if it exists, might have in a particular context, the context of criminal justice. So that's the general idea of what we're going to discuss. So I hope you find it interesting. So I want to begin by just talking about the idea of respect and respecting people and what we often think about when we're talking about that. So many of us think that as rational and autonomous beings, we have a right to be respected as such. That we're owed certain duties of respect because of the kind of rational and autonomous beings that we are. And by rational and autonomous beings or agents, I mean things that can reason about what we want to do and can try and guide our actions in accordance with what we think we have most reason to do. And a long line of thinkers inspired by Kant, even though it's sometimes disagreed with whether this is exactly what Kant had in mind. He had a particular view of autonomy, but a long line of thinkers think, and in everyday life, we think that there are certain things that because we're rational beings, that people have to do with respect to us, the way they have to treat us. So we think it's presumptively wrong for others to make our decisions for us, to treat us like children or as mere things or tools. We also think sometimes that it's wrong, at least presumptively wrong, if people treat us as though we're incompetent or fail to take into consideration our views when it comes to collective decision making. So there's this general idea that we have a moral right to be respected as a rational and autonomous being. This doesn't mean an absolute right. So we may think that at times it's a defeasible right, that it can at times be overridden by other considerations. But we tend to think, not everyone, but many people tend to think that we have this right such that if people fail to treat us as rational autonomous beings or fail to respect us as rational autonomous beings, then they owe us some sort of apology or to make amends to us. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So what I want to talk about here is whether we have a parallel moral right to be respected as social beings. I want to discuss what that might mean and whether there's some reasons to think that we do. So by social beings here, I mean beings that have the capacity, propensity, and need to socially connect with others and to live a socially integrated life. Doesn't mean we always want to be social with us, but we're beings that have this sort of capacity. It's fairly uncontroversial to say that humans are social beings, that they have social needs and propensities or desires to connect and integrate with others. Okay, so before I say a little more, I want to just say that when you start to write about something, you find that lots of other people have already said things in different ways or similar ways. So nothing is ever quite original, but then you have your own spin on it. So a lot of scholars over the years have spoken about the importance of human sociality or socialness. So Eva Kitay, who's a care ethicist and feminist philosopher, spoke about the importance of that our moral status, so let's say humans' moral status that makes us the bearer of rights, was grounded not just in our rationality and autonomy, but also in our relationality, our capacity to relate to others. So that's a similar sort of thought. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum said something like our characteristic human dignity, which can be seen as our moral status, is grounded both in our practical agency or autonomy and our sociability. So it's a similar sort of point. Another philosopher, Thaddeus Metz, thinks that the ground of our moral status comes from our capacity to relate in a communal way to others. So he draws on African relational ethics in his ideas there. And more recently, another scholar, Kimberly Brownlee, has argued that because we're social beings, we have certain morally urgent social needs. And she argues that they ground some distinctively social human rights. So she makes a case that we have a human right against social deprivation. And she makes a case for the idea that we have a human right to socially contribute. And by this, she means to contribute to the survival and well-being of particular others. But in Brownlee's work about social human rights, she also says that when we infringe the rights that she defends, we not only set back the relevant person's social needs, she feels is what grounds these rights, but we also fail to respect persons' nature as social beings. So she speaks about respect there, even though she doesn't defend as such a right to respect. So all these things are ideas that are floating out there. And in this talk, as I said, I want to carve out a space for the concept and practice of respecting people as social beings, which I said was treat people in a way that befits their social nature and which expresses the message that their sociality has value. Then I want to consider whether persons have a moral right to receive such respect. And then, as I said, that means that people and institutions have a defeasible duty owed to persons to respect them as social beings. And then I look to see what this might mean in the context of criminal justice. Okay, so what do I mean by disrespecting people as social beings? Well, I start by just giving some sort of cases which might seem to motivate that there's a distinct thing to disrespect people as social beings is distinct from disrespecting them as rational beings or autonomous beings. So imagine, first of all, that we have a homeless person who's sitting on the street. And imagine that most people who walk past completely ignore this person, look through them, sometimes walk to the other side of the street to avoid having to make eye contact to interact with them. Then another scenario might be considered where we have a city or a community or town where there are two kind of social groups. So let's say imagine one group are immigrant group and others group have lived there all their life. So we can think, I have a picture from West Side Story there to try and describe that. And imagine in this instance, both groups leave each other alone. So unlike in West Side Story, they don't fight with each other. They don't try and restrict the freedom of the respective, the other group. But nonetheless, they don't interact at all. They don't mingle. They don't make eye contact if they're out on the street. They don't acknowledge or ever ask the people from the other group how they're doing. And then imagine another scenario where, let's say in the future, progress in automation and artificial intelligence have made it such that everyone can work from home. And that things are automated and we don't have to go out and about to do anything, really. And imagine in this kind of scenario that the respective governments don't do anything to encourage social interaction, don't provide any sort of public spaces or put resources into these public spaces so that people don't have opportunities to just randomly encounter each other. Now, I think in all of these scenarios, it seems that there's something regrettable going on. Now, one thing that's regrettable could be that in these scenarios, maybe some people don't have their social needs satisfied. So let's say they don't have enough access to contact with other human beings. But suppose in these cases, people do actually manage. So suppose the homeless person is friends with very many other homeless people and they have a good sense of solidarity among their group. Imagine the same with the two different groups, that they have lots of close connections within their group. And imagine that in the situation where we all work from home, that people still manage to find companions, friends, and to have at least a few core social contacts. In this case, I think it might be a bit counterintuitive to some, but I think that in this case, there's still something that is happening that wrongs the person involved. It seems as if the homeless person is still disrespected by those who pass by, even if they have a strong social network otherwise. The same with the two groups. And I think that in the case, if a government who doesn't evince any sort of care about whether people's social needs are being met, even if they are managing on their own, seems to be some way disrespectful. And by disrespect, we can see it as disrespect is usually a way in which we respond to something of value. So it's different from liking or loving something. But if we respect something, it means that we acknowledge that the thing is important or valuable in some way, such that it makes sort of claims on our behavior. So we can respect a law, we can respect an object, we can respect a work of art, we can respect people. But usually, as a sort of behavioral response, respect is something we bestow on things that we think are valuable. And in these sort of cases, I think it seems that the relevant parties are disrespecting people as social beings and that they're not acknowledging that their sociality is of value. I hope that makes sense. Okay, right. So, what sort of behaviors then are required to respect someone as a social being, first of all? What sort of behaviors are required to acknowledge that person's sociality or their socialness is valuable or important? And here, I draw a little bit on some of the work that has already been done on the topic of respect by some of the philosophers. So Joseph Raz and Sarah Buss have spoken about the kind of behaviors that respect more generally requires. So if we think of something like a piece of art, what sort of things would we need to respect it, or any sort of object? And they point to first that we probably need some sort of recognitional behaviors, treating the thing properly as the kind of thing that it is. So we respect the law if we obey it. We don't respect it if we don't obey it. Laws are the kind of things that are meant to be obeyed. Similarly, we might respect a church if we act in certain ways when we're inside it versus not doing so. And we might respect a knife if we use it for cutting something rather than bending it this way and that to make something else out of it. So treating a thing properly is one thing that we do when we want to show that we respect something. Sometimes also we engage in preservational type behavior. So if we think something is valuable and important and hence want to respect it, we tend to protect it. We tend to not destroy it. So we don't destroy a work of art if we think it's worthy of respect. And aside from non-destruction and protection, sometimes respecting something requires that we make some efforts to restore or replenish it. So sometimes if we're in appropriate position to do so and can do so at little cost to ourselves, it seems that if we don't make an effort to help preserve something, we're sending out the message that it's not that important. So for example, if a wealthy country has some work of art destroyed, or imagine Notre Dame burns down and no one makes any effort to restore or preserve it, we might think that if one can, or if a state can, then they're doing so shows that they consider it to be important. They're not doing so might imply that they consider it not to be that important. Okay, so they're the sort of broad behaviors that I think we need if we are to respect something. And putting that to the case, we talk about this with rational agency. We say to respect people as rational beings, we have to treat them as rational beings. So let's say treat them properly, give them reasons, not make their decisions for them. And when people, let's say, are losing autonomy, let's say older people who are people with less mobility, we sometimes say that we should do something to protect and preserve their autonomy if we can. So with sociality, I think it's the same sort of thing. Respecting someone as a social being means that we treat them as though they're social beings. So it doesn't mean we have to fully engage with them and like and love them, but it means we have to treat them as the kind of beings with whom we could potentially interact, to acknowledge that they're that sort of being in some way. And it also means that if people's social resources are compromised, so let's say they have fewer social opportunities, or their social abilities have been affected by certain experiences, that we do something to try and help protect and preserve their ability, their practical ability to socially interact and integrate with others. This is the general idea. Okay, so why think that people have a moral right to be respected as social beings, which means why think that others have a duty, defeasible duty, to respect them as social beings? And here I think one way of arguing for this is to try and focus on an interest-based sort of grounding. So a lot of the time, one theory of rights is that we have rights to something, moral rights, if we have a strong enough interest in having the thing. So on an interest-based theory of rights, whether we have a right to something means, at least in part, that we have a strong interest in having it. So one thing to argue here would be to see whether we have a strong interest in receiving respect as a social being. But of course, even if we do, we don't have a right to everything we have an interest in. Clearly, we have an interest that many people like us, and we don't have a right that they do. So as well as having an interest in receiving respect, it must also be the case that our sociality must warrant or be worthy of respect if we are to say that we have a right, a claim on others that they respect us. So I think that there are some things that can be said in favor of both of these claims. Some things that could be said that we have an interest in being respected, and some things that can be said in favor of the idea that our sociality warrants respect. I hope you're all still with me. So with respect to the interest, now clearly we have an interest in having our social needs satisfied, first of all. So if we have no social connections, there's ample evidence to suggest it affects our well-being. But I'm not just arguing here for the sort of social human rights that Kimberly Brownlee is arguing for, which she justifies on the basis of our strong social needs or interests. I'm arguing for this right to respect. So do we have an interest in receiving respect, even if we have our social needs satisfied? So say we have adequate number of friends, do we have a general interest that governments, states, institutions, and other persons respect us as social beings? And there's some reason to think that we do, because there's evidence to suggest that when we are disrespected, let's say as a social being in the form of being ostracized or excluded, it can feel similar to physical pain. So there's evidence to suggest the neural pathways that process social exclusion and ostracizing are the same as those that process physical pain. And apparently we can feel this pain even when we don't particularly care about the being that is excluding us. So there's evidence to suggest that, we can feel there can be a negative impact on our well-being and distress when we're ostracized by a computer, by strangers on Facebook, all these things. Now, presumably it's not as bad for us as if people we really care about exclude us, but still, it seems we are very hypersensitive to any evidence of social exclusion, and it can cause us, can have a negative impact on our well-being. As well as that, there is theoretical and empirical research that suggests that being respected by others is important for us to cultivate a positive sense of self or a sense of self-worth. Being respected in many different ways. So being respected as an autonomous being that has their own independence, does so, but also being respected as other social addressee, as someone who they can interact with. So there's it's a long line of theorists, sometimes called recognition theorists, that talk about the importance of recognition, being recognized for what one is, which is similar in some ways to the idea of being respected as the kind of thing that one is. And there's some empirical data to suggest that things like being socially excluded and ignored, ostracized, can make it difficult to maintain a positive sense of self-worth. And self-worth plausibly has value for us, regardless of what theory of well-being we adopt, whether we think that well-being is a matter of having positive feelings, or whether we think it's about having some objective goods. Self-worth plausibly has value regardless of the type of theory we adopt. So there are just some preliminary reasons to think we might have an interest in being respected as a social being. I want to say just a little bit now about the idea that the fact that we're social beings probably warrants respect. And here I'm appealing to two reasons that are sometimes advanced to support the idea that our rationality and autonomy warrants respect. So one idea might be that our socialness or sociality makes the world a better place. So some people, not everyone agrees, but some people say that our rational and autonomous agency makes the world a better place. That a world in which we have beings minded beings who can reason about things is a better place than a world where we have no minded entities at all. They also point to some of the achievements of a rational autonomous agency, science, morality, everything like this. And then this is a reason to think that rational and autonomous agency might warrant respect. Now, I think that this reason also seems to be applicable to the case for sociality. So it seems to me that a world in which we seek and need the company of others is infinitely to be preferred over a world in which we live totally isolated, independent lives, notwithstanding that others frequently cause us hardship and harm. It also seems that many of the things that we prize as outcomes or outputs of a rational autonomous agency are painfully joint, our collective endeavors, so like morality, science, etc. And having the fact that we are social beings opens us up to lots of goods like friendship, love, altruism, knowledge exchange, etc. So I think there's reason to think that the fact we're social beings makes the world a better place. The other reason then is also one that is used in the literature on reasons to respect us as rational and autonomous beings. So some Kantian scholars argue, so Christine Korsgaard is one, that our rational and autonomous agency is the source of all value. So because we are rational and autonomous beings, it means we are valuers. We value things, so we confer value on things. The idea is that if we didn't have valuers like us in the world, then nothing would really have value. For something to have value, there needs to be something who values it, who confers the value on it. So it's the idea that that warrants respect, that if we think that things that are valuable warrants respect, then we have to also respect the source of all value, if that makes sense. My thought here is that, well, if we think that rational autonomous agency warrants respect because it is the source of all value, then we should also think that the prerequisites for rational and autonomous agency also warrant respect. And it's plausible that our sociality is a prerequisite for rational autonomous agency. So on one prominent evolutionary theory our rational autonomous agency developed in response to our hypersociality as a means to enable us to collaborate effectively with others. There's also both theoretical and empirical research that suggests that when it is only through others that we develop and maintain rational autonomous agency. So some theories suggest that it's through embodied social interaction with other persons that we get a sense of ourselves as separate and develop a sense of how to reason and interact. There's also African philosophy speaks of it, puts it the way that a person is a person only through other persons. So there's also evidence to suggest that children who lack social connection with particular others, sustained social connection, fail to develop rational autonomous agency along the typical trajectory. There's also evidence to suggest that perceived social isolation in adulthood can accelerate cognitive decline and lead to reductions in autonomous agency. So these are just some ideas that if we accept the idea that rational and autonomous agency warrants respect, which many do, then it seems that we should also be committed to the idea that sociality warrants respect. Okay, so I'll move very quickly because I know we want to have time for a bit of talk as well. But I want to say just a little bit about the implications of this idea for the treatment of those who offend. So I think that if we think that there's some case to be made for the idea that there's a moral right to be respected as social beings, I think it has implications in many contexts. So of course, I already mentioned homelessness and how we treat people who are homeless. There might be other things like how we treat people in mental health care facilities. Possibly also implications with respect to automation and the design of AI systems. And then obviously interpersonal implications as to politeness and how we interact with each other. But when it comes to the context of criminal justice, I think it seems to give us two sort of outcomes. I think it gives reason to think that we should have a presumption against imprisonment as the default punishment for serious offences. So currently, it is in many countries the default punishment for serious offences. Also sometimes for not so serious offences. So some people are punished who have not committed, let's say, violent crimes. And I think that it is possible to argue that imprisonment as a punishment, as an exclusionary form of punishment, fails to treat people as befits their sociality. Now, this doesn't mean that we can never imprison people, or we should never imprison people, because sometimes public safety and security will mean that someone is quite dangerous. But using it as a sort of routine punishment seems to be unfitting. It's not treating people in a way that befits their social needs and their propensity to live in a socially integrated state. So I think that that's it. The idea of being respected as a social being, if we buy it, seems to lend support to the prison abolitionists' cause. The second thing I think that this idea of right to be respected as a social being might imply in criminal justice is a duty on the part of states to provide access to rehabilitative and reintegrated services. So not just because it's a nice thing to do, or not just because it might lead to better consequences overall and lead to better public safety, but actually that it might be something that are owed to those who offend, because they are social beings. So this is part of the preservation element of the type of behavior, that if a person's social resources are compromised following their offending, so let's say there will often be stigma and ruptured relationships, regardless of whether someone is also imprisoned, though that would make things worse, then expressing respect for the fact that people are social beings, manifesting respect, would seem to entail that we provide access to resources to help them restore or build new social relationships. And that's the idea there. I can anticipate that many would have many objections to these ideas. There's plenty of objections, which we can discuss if we have time, but that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I hope that makes sense to people. Thank you.